Welcome to Talking Feds, a roundtable that brings together prominent former federal officials and special guests for a dynamic discussion of the most important political and legal topics of the day. I'm Harry Littman. Both Joe Biden and Donald Trump secured the number of delegates required to make them the nominees of the two major parties this week, so the field is now cleared, and we are at the threshold of a long, contentious, and hugely consequential general election season. Trump's ascent to the verge of the presidency, less than 4 years after attempting to violently seize power after losing the election, is a remarkable, if alarming, achievement in U.S. political history that suggests, as the New York Times put it, a case of collective amnesia on the part of American voters. In the meantime, there are tangible indications of loss of political support for Biden among cohorts who voted for him in 2020. The polls predict a tight race, with the election likely again to be decided by narrow margins in 6 to 7 swing states. Strange weather in Fulton County, Georgia, and Manhattan resulted in delays in the criminal trials scheduled there against Trump. The judge in Fulton County rejected Trump's motion to disqualify DA Fani Willis, but with scathing language that assured that the controversy surrounding the case would continue, even after the resignation of Nathan Wade, the prosecutor and paramour that she brought aboard to handle the case. To suss out the Trump-Biden rematch at the starting line and the overall political mood of the country, we have a great group of political thinkers and former officials to help size up how things stand at the starting line of the most significant election in our lifetimes. And they are Barbara Boxer, a former U.S. Congresswoman and Senator from California. She served in Congress from 1983 to 2017. Her memoir, The Art of Tough, Fearlessly Facing Politics and Life, was published in 2016. Welcome back to Talking Fed, Senator Boxer.
Thank you so much.
Jason Kander, the president of the National Expansion at the Veterans Community Project, a nonprofit dedicated to fighting veteran suicide and homelessness. He served in Afghanistan as an Army intelligence officer. Thank you for your service. And he now hosts the popular podcast, Majority 54. We covered his book, Invisible Storm, A Soldier's Memoir of Politics and PTSD in a Talking Books episode. Thank you very much, Jason Kander, for being with us.
Thanks for having me back.
And David French, an opinion columnist with the New York Times, a former JAG officer deployed to Iraq in 2007. He earned a Bronze Star with the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment. Thank you for your service, David. He's the author of Divided We Fall, America's Secession Threat and How to Restore Our Nation. David French, always a pleasure to welcome you back to Talking Feds.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, as Stephen Colbert put it, the inevitable inevitted this week as both Trump and Biden locked up a sufficient number of delegates to secure their parties' respective nominations. So let's start here. We're now at the starting line for an 8-month general election, a very long general election season. But Trump and Biden already had turned their sights on one another. Has anything changed in practice? Is there some political or cultural significance to where we have come starting this week?
It seems that after the State of the Union, we're slightly less freaked out about Biden coming across as too old. And all it took was people watching him for an extended period of time and not just in edited clips for, an hour and a half, plus, all the glad handing before and after. And look, I'll be honest, I imagine a pretty good adrenaline rush comes with delivering the State of the Union. And I'm not saying that, therefore, we won't have to worry about that. I'm saying we're not talking about it this week. That seems like progress.
I'll just make a quick legal point, which is they immediately tried to reinstate it with the Robert Hur hearing. And I actually thought one of the upsides of the hearing was to make that charge, which to my mind never really had a place in the report just as far as DOJ guidelines go, but to make it less credible because we saw the entire transcript. I hope none of you has had the misfortune to be deposed for 5 hours, but the sound bites from those events are always discouraging. But he was overall clear-headed and really on top of things by her own estimate. Still, the issue, I guess, is not going away. Well, so let me put it this way instead. What is different now about this head-to-head matchup as opposed to the 2020 head-to-head?
Well, Harry, first of all, I agree with Jason. I think that was great. Biden says, I'm going to show you, just look at me. And I think that's a message to his team. Just let him beat Joe. Look, I know him forever. That I'm not kidding. When I went to the House in the 80s, he was a good friend. I supported him for president all those millions of years ago. So he's never been slick. He's never been smooth. He's always been underestimated. And his whole way of delivering his speech is tough because of his stutter that he had all those years ago. And I think just coming out and being honest about it, as the crazy orange man, makes fun of people who have any type of disability, I think it warms people's hearts. But now that it's a one-on-one, and I'll conclude with this, here's the deal. We now see Trump, he's off the wall. And so if people said Joe Biden made mistakes, let's compare the two. I mean, that's off the table in my opinion. But now that it's clear, the record of Trump for 4 years, the record of Biden for almost 4 years, I'll just talk about two things. Trump is the only president since records have been kept who left office with fewer jobs in America than there were when he was sworn in, while Joe Biden is record-breaking jobs, 15 million. So you have a job-destroying former president with a job-creating current president. Secondly, every 26 seconds under Trump, someone was dying of COVID. And we were like lost souls then. And Joe Biden, he had a hard time with it, but he got people vaccinated. He turned it around, and now it's still there, but it's not running our lives. So those are just two things. There's 1,000 others, but I don't want to take up any more time.
I would say what we are dealing with is a situation where the gap between the two candidates is even starker than it was in 2020, and the public is more checked out than it was in 2020. And that really works to Joe Biden's disadvantage. Because if you look at what's different from 2020, I can list 4 to 5 major things right off the top of my head, beginning with, well, in 2020, we suspected, but we didn't know that Donald Trump would not even consent to a peaceful transfer of power. So we've seen January 6th since 2020. We've seen the invasion of Ukraine since 2020. To me, this is the most important issue in the world, is the invasion of Ukraine. And Trump is just flat out wrong about it. And even worse than being wrong about it, he's wrong about it for the dumbest reasons you can possibly imagine, like that Ukraine actually interfered in the election in 2016, and he's mad about that. But the problem is Americans are really checking out of all of this. And so millions of Americans don't know how much more weird Donald Trump has become. That sounds strange to say, but there's recent polling showing that a majority of Republicans just really don't know much at all about the charges against Donald Trump. Huge numbers of independents don't know much at all about the charges against Donald Trump. And if you look at the traffic to media sites, it's just gone down, 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 down over the last 4 years. And so what we've seen is just a giant withdrawal of the American people when they need to be more aware, when they need to be more engaged. I think that withdrawal is one of Biden's biggest challenges, to be frank.
I so agree. But I want to be a little bit more hopeful.
Please.
Yeah, I'm going to try. I've run for office 12 times and 4 times statewide in a state with millions and millions of people. People were always checked out until after Labor Day of the election year, honest to God. And I know it's horrifying considering what anyone who's sort of watched with half an eye as to what is happening. But it is our job, all of us, to wake this electorate up, because there's no question if they're checked out. There's no question. Here in California for this primary, we had a 33% turnout. Are you kidding? It's horrible. But on the general, it better be 50, at least 60. So you're right, but I don't think it's that unusual.
I want to follow up a little, maybe serve this up to Jason, because there is something phenomenal about the level of checkout we have. There was a long piece in the Times this week. Do Americans have collective amnesia about Donald Trump? And the point that David made about one of the salient differences, after January 6th, there was a strong bipartisan consensus on the facts that Trump had tried to steal the election, and you would think that should be offensive to voters on all sides. Yet he's managed to return to have the presidency again in his grasp. So let me serve that up and add just to the pot here. Who is Donald Trump to American voters at this point, if you have a sense of it?
At this point, Donald Trump, to too large of a amount of American voters, is a character in an episodic show that they've taken a break from and that they know they're going to have to go back to. And the thing, like, how many streaming services do you subscribe to?
I have to ask my son. I think because however many it is, I can't turn the TV on, but that's a different point.
Yeah, but so for me, it's like, I'm thinking in my head, it's like Disney Plus, Netflix. It's like at least 3, right? So one of the things that's changed in the last few years is the amount of potential content to consume has blown out. And around 2015, 2016, Donald Trump's entrance into politics coincided with this long journey of merging pop culture and politics, which sort of accelerated when Donald Trump entered politics. And so we've gone on this journey where politics and popular culture merged over the last 8 years. And now our politics is competing with the other stuff available in our popular culture. And the truth is that if this were an episodic show and it still had as its main characters Donald Trump and Joe Biden, it would have been canceled.
Yeah, time for the B plot. That's a really great point. Yeah.
But it hasn't been. But also at the same time, I agree with Senator Boxer. I've not run for office 12 times, but I've run for office enough times to know that weird feeling of up until Labor Day, you are like, why is no one paying attention to this thing that consumes my entire life from the moment I wake up to the moment I go to sleep? And it's like all I think about, right? And so I do think people will re-engage. And when they re-engage, my hope is that they go, to David's point, holy crap, no, he didn't really say that, right? Or is he really going to get convicted of that? That's my hope.
You know, there's some interesting comparisons between a Trump rally in 2016, a Trump rally in 2020, and a Trump rally now, and just how incredibly weird the Trump rallies are now. I mean, you have to be absolutely fully steeped in sort of the MAGA conspiracy extended universe to even know what he's talking about. But nobody's seeing any of this. Nobody. And they will see it. I mean, and the Biden team will make sure they see it. But there's another factor here in play. There's something about Joe Biden and his administration that is good for America, but bad for him politically versus Donald Trump. And that is, he doesn't have a cult. Trump has a cult. And so what that means is he has this high floor of support of that absolute core that will never, ever, ever leave him. And his policies don't matter. I mean, this is the guy who in 2020 drafted an executive order to ban TikTok. And now in 2024, when a billionaire waves some cash in front of him, he's all against it. And so he has no principles, but he has the following. Whereas Joe Biden has to, on the one hand, reach and pull in people to his left who are right now very upset about the conflict in Gaza, while also pulling in people to his right who are upset about the conflict in Gaza for opposite reasons. And so he actually has to go out and persuade, which is good for us as a country because we need more politicians trying to win us over rather than bullying us into positions. So that's good for the country, but he's got that lower floor in some ways because he's got a coalition. It's a diverse coalition, and Trump has a following, and that's a different thing.
That is absolutely right, spot on. It's spot on. I mean, we all know this. Trump could do anything, and these people in the cult will figure out a way. I mean, I've been reading some of the things they say, God sent him and all of this stuff.
Oh, yeah.
It's so frightening. But here's the deal. I think that's what campaigns are about. They're about stating the obvious that we all know to be true, whether it's the jobs, whether it's January 6th, where he waited more than 3 hours to stop the insurrectionists, and people died because of that, whether it's his craziness on COVID, and we could go on. I think what's key here is to make the campaign, even though we want to make it about Trump, make it about the American people. For example, if you are a woman and you believe that you should have the respect to decide your own health care, or if you are a man and you care about women and you respect their right, you have to vote for Joe. I mean, you may not like this or that about him, but this is it. If you are a disabled person, all right, or anyone who knows one, show how Trump makes fun of disabled people and go on and on. The people that he has offended, veterans, suckers, losers. It's going to have to be a very smart campaign to wake the people up, as my two colleagues here have pointed out. We have to wake them up out of their lethargy and make it about them and their families, their loved ones. And in many cases, don't forget what James Carville said, it's the economy, stupid. I bet you people don't know that Trump was the worst in terms of job creation, 2.9 million jobs lost.
They not only don't know it, they believe the opposite.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we have to have a Republican economist on in front of the folks. We have to have the people who will break this down. And I've always said the people that are going to win this for us are going to be the Republicans who left that party, and we see many of them day by day, and who worked for Trump. Get them on television. They have credibility. And the independents who are appalled by this. So it's going to be a rough I think where we started was the apathy, and where we have to come down at the end of the day is waking the people up, because guess what? It's their lives. It's their future. And, I appreciate democracy is a huge issue. It's a little obtuse for most people because they don't really get it. We have to talk about it. But it's these other issues that are really at the kitchen table that I think we have to push.
I think that's right, that democracy is obtuse, and it's so frustrating, right? Because it's like obtuse for people the way that if you tell a fish the main issue is water, like it's always lived in it, and people are like, but we live in America. How can you tell me that whether America keeps being America? But it's increasingly getting across to people. But I think what is really interesting and scary about the challenge that the Democrats and that Biden have in front of us is that we sort of have to run as the minority party. And what I mean by that is, in order to make people appropriately afraid of the extremism that will confront us if Trump wins, we can't run with the modern sort of short attention span world that we live in. We can't run in look, it could be like it was, because to the point that's been made, there is some amnesia. It's got to be about here's what they will do. And that means that you can't get trapped in the easy stuff, right? This is what Trump said, this is what Trump's doing, because everybody knows that. Like, these characters are baked in and people are tired of them. If you are still considering, or if you are voting for Trump, you're doing it knowing that he sucks as a person. And that's why the entire Trump campaign seems to have been built around the idea of mitigating how much he sucks to make you feel like maybe Biden is also a bad person, right? That's been a huge part of their campaign.
Or Hunter.
Right. I mean, by extension, right? I mean, that's their way in. And so what I think this is going to come down to, and I think Senator Boxer is right about this, is just making the case that, hey, in a way, we are the minority party. They have the Supreme Court. They have the House. We have to fight against this extremism. And that'll come through issues like Dobbs. It'll come through issues like extremism on democracy, that kind of, and corruption. And that, I think, will work, but it's going to be very tight.
David, you made a column that love got Trump the nomination, but it'll take hate for him to win the White House. And can you explain what you meant? And I guess to dovetail it with the senator and Jason, is there enough hate in the country, or will there be enough hate in the country come November to propel him to a second term?
Yeah. And so by that, I meant that what's won Trump the nomination unquestionably is, let's go back to the cult word. These people adore him. They love him. They were a plurality. His absolute core was a plurality of the Republican Party. And then people who are just one step removed from that adoration make support for him it's an unshakable majority at this point. I mean, has been a little bit encouraging to me to see that Nikki Haley, before she dropped out, consistently got around that 30% number to show that there was no Trump monopoly. But here's the thing. So that unshakable majority of the Republican Party is very much a minority of the United States of America. So to pull in enough votes, you don't even have to say majority anymore, but pull in enough votes in the swing states, a strong enough minority of Americans to defeat Biden, even if he loses the popular vote and wins the Electoral College, he's got to motivate people to vote because they hate the Democrats, not so much because they love him. Because Trump doesn't have a lot of love outside the Republican Party. So he's got to flip it around. And you've already seen his people doing this and his allies doing this. And it's, you may not love him, but the Democrats will destroy America. Joe Biden will destroy America. And so I live in a very, very MAGA community. And this is exactly how they keep dissenting Republicans or right-leaning independents in line, is they capitalize on building up hate against the Democrats because they know that not enough Republicans love Trump to push him over the finish line. You have to use that hatred and the negative polarization that dominates American politics now to pull in the rest. And that's, in many ways, the most dangerous way to campaign because he is fueling conflict. He is fueling division as his only way to win.
Yeah, I mean, I think all of us are hesitant about jumping to historical analogs, although apparently not Trump, who expressed some admiration for Adolf Hitler. But that basic strategy of division and sowing of hatred, that is a page from former fascist leaders.
It's frightening. So that's why I say, who preaches hate? Trump preaches hate. Who is the object of the hate? Women are the object of the hate. Sometimes veterans are the object of the hate, disabled. It seems to me immigrants, and we all come from immigrant families. How disgraceful, including him. I call it the silent majority. So if we're smart, if we could take that hate and say, hey, you know what? There's a lot of hate out there, and it's against us, and we want to fight back. So it is tricky. It is hard. But we're going to have to be smart about how we do it. And getting back to where we started, the low turnout is we're done for. It was brought up that Nikki Haley vote. Very interesting. Let's even call it 20%. Okay. Don't even call it 30. Let's just say at this stage it's 20. That's a good thing. If we can grab that 20%, and we can get 52% of independent voters and 90+% of Dems, and it's a decent turnout, that's the way we're going to do it. But also, it's the swing states, and they're difficult. I worry about that as well.
I would just say that what is comforting to me about this election is that because everybody knows what they think about Joe Biden, which is most of the time they don't think about Joe Biden, and what they think about Donald Trump, which is they don't like him, but sometimes they like that he dislikes the people they dislike. Sometimes. I actually think what's refreshing about this is it's probably going to come down to policies. I really just think that this election is almost as close as you can get, with the exception of David's point about the cult following for Trump. If you can set that aside for a moment, because there is also not a cult following, but there is a solid voting bloc that's always going to vote Dem as well. So when you put those things together, this may be the closest we're going to see to generic D versus generic R. And that means that it's just going to come down to exactly what Senator Boxer's talking about. The arguments about the Dobbs decision, the arguments about things like student loans, the arguments about the economy.
Abortion, immigration. Yeah.
Exactly. And so if that ends up being the case, that does make me feel more confident because polling is what it is. But every time we have a special election in a particularly contested place, the Democrats tend to win those.
There's a pitch I think that Biden can make to right-leaning independents and disgruntled conservatives. And that is, I think he can go straight in with a pitch that is related to the classic three legs of the Reagan conservative stool. And that is, in his 4 years, America is stronger. So, for example, the accession of Sweden and Finland into NATO, is a very substantial boost to American national security. Those are potent countries with potent militaries that are now formally in the American-led alliance. That's a new thing. The AUKUS agreement with Australia, these are niche issues, but they actually make America stronger. Also, he's the one demonstrating strength versus Russia. I thought it was brilliant of Biden to start the State of the Union with Reagan says, tear down that wall. Trump says to Putin, do whatever the hell you want. I think that was very smart. Trump presided over historic crime increase. Biden has presided over historic crime decrease. And then prosperity. On prosperity, right now, the United States economy is the envy of the world. The Economist magazine just keeps saying this like 10, 15 times, it seems like. If you look at all the developed countries, America's recovery from COVID is just the envy of the world. And I think coming forward with that message is one that will really resonate with a lot of the very same swing voters, suburban voters, former Republicans who put Biden in the White House. And the other thing I'd say is if the election were held today, I would not feel optimistic for Joe Biden, but the election is not held today. And history tells us that parties that have these contentious primaries with incumbents, and Trump is really running as an incumbent in essence in his own party, they don't tend to win in November. Let's go back. Ford, 76, primary challenge, couldn't win. 80, Carter, primary challenge, couldn't win. 92, Bush, primary challenge, couldn't ultimately win. Those significant primary challenges do indicate actual real discontent within the base of the president's own party, or in this case, former presidents. So there's some historical reasons to really question whether that Trump coalition is quite as strong as the polling today seems to indicate that it is.
I think David just laid out a beautiful way to go forward. What I think David is embracing is this notion that it's about us, it's about our country. And, let's just be real about this comparison. And I think that works in our favor. I also think it's mainstream versus extreme. And that is clear. And yes, we're going to lose some far left people over Gaza, and it's very, very tough. And we could talk about that. But the bottom line is we are a mainstream country. And if we get the mainstream of the Dems, the mainstream of the Republicans, and the mainstream of the independents, and we get a decent turnout, we win.
An interesting point that surfaced here that I don't think I have fully thought about anyway, and maybe listeners feel the same way, is the possibility that all of this is noise and the focus is both temporally, what's going to happen starting a few months from now, but not until then, and within these specific swing states and the like. And, there's insatiable desire to try to make conclusions and figure out what's happening, but maybe it's just more than the system can rationally produce for us. I'll end where I started, which is this is a long general election season that's starting this month, 8 full months. All right. I want to stay on the possible bad news that Biden's been receiving about a few constituencies, the, anti-Gaza war crowd. There's also, and I'm sure, David, you're feeling this in Texas, so the Latino vote. That cohort seemed reliably Democratic. It might now be slipping away from the Dems' grasp. Some polls show Trump getting 40% of Latino voters. What's driving that shift, and what can the Dems and Biden do about it?
Yeah, there's two things. One is a question I think it's easier for Democrats to address, and one is harder. So there's two things. One is a lot of this change with Hispanic voters and also with especially Black male voters that you've seen in polling is driven in part by the shift of the working class. There's been more of a working class shift to the Trump GOP, and more educated voters are leaving the Trump GOP. So part of this is reflective of a broader working class cultural shift, which I think Biden is more able to address on a policy basis. Let's just set up, here's what we're going to do, here's what Trump is going to do. I think he's got issues and policies that he can use to appeal. Now, the other thing, though, is, and a lot of people don't know this, the American Hispanic population is increasingly evangelical, but also in a very specific way. It's increasingly Pentecostal. And so the Pentecostal branch of American evangelicalism, that's Trump's core. If evangelical supporters are his core, then Pentecostals are his core of his core. It's sort of the most working class branch of American Christianity. And also it's the one in which the prophecies that Senator Boxer talked about earlier, that's where these prophecies are coming from. And so an awful lot of people are in these Pentecostal churches, and an awful lot of Hispanic folks are in these Pentecostal churches. And that's where the cultural pull towards Donald Trump is really, really strong. And so part of this is just the natural consequence of the religious affiliation with the broader evangelical movement that a lot of, Hispanic, especially folks who are coming out of the more recent waves of migration are, the American citizens who are being born as a result of the more recent waves of migration are people who are part of that burgeoning and growing evangelical community within Hispanic America.
That's a great point. And I think it actually lends itself not just to the Hispanic community, but also to some of the decrease in support in the Black community. I mean, the social conservatism in the Black community is always underestimated. And I say this as one of 4 white people on this podcast.
Touche, but yes.
I will put forward some sort of bona fide for this, which is just that I've spent a lot of time as a campaigner, spent a lot of time in Black church, sitting, listening to sermons. And it always startled me how much actual social conservatism you would tend to hear from the pulpit, which means that as the economy is improving, for minority groups who are also feeling improvement in the economy, it creates this sort of internal permission structure to look more at social issues. I mean, I've had several friends of mine who are African American say things to me like, everybody just assumes that I'm going to vote Democratic. But as I go into a higher income bracket, I consider the Republican Party more and more, right? Into a higher tax bracket. And so what it all brings me to is something that people have been talking about for several years, but I am now finally starting to see the Biden campaign really employ it, which is a shift from viewing Black voters in particular as needing to hear a turnout message and instead making sure to target them with a persuasion message. And we're starting to see that more and more. And that makes me feel a little more optimistic that we're actually treating them like real voters and not like people we just need to remind to vote.
Well, that's a really important point. We cannot take anybody for granted. I mean, Jason knows this. When you run for office, you got to say to people, will you vote for me? You can't assume they're going to. And it takes a certain humility. And Joe Biden is very good at that. But I don't get alarmed at realignments now and then. I just don't. And you're not going to get, 100% of Hispanics or Blacks or Jewish voters, but you're going to get solid majorities. But in all cases, whether you're religious or not, or whatever color your skin, or you need a healthy economy. You need a good healthcare system. You need to be able to access things for your family, housing, and the rest. So yes, I'm not stunned that, I thought David's point about the preference of certain religions, we know what they are, but still in all, they need to live and thrive. We all do. So my politics always tended to be inclusionary, acknowledging the differences. So, but it's just pointing out, it is surprising when you see after a president insults brown voters like he does, totally insults Black voters like he does every day almost. And yet you see some shifting towards him. We just have to be able to not take anyone for granted. And yes, Jason's right. Give them the reasons why they should vote for us and why they should vote for Trump. So it's a tough election. Nothing could be taken for granted. And I think a lot of the things we said today will be useful. I hope some of the Biden folks listen to your podcast.
I just want to follow up with this a little. It's one cohort, but a very interesting one, and one, David, you've written a lot about, and it goes again to this point that we surfaced earlier of 20 versus 24. So you've written a lot about the evangelical community in Texas and generally. The era of Trump is our last choice. That's for evangelicals is over. It's now the era of Trump is our first choice. And this, to talk about the disconnect that the senator just mentioned, we're talking about a guy with, really flagrantly, I think you could say, Christian conduct, and yet he's, risen to be not just a default, but an embraced first choice. Can you explain that a little, how you see it happening and what its implications are?
It's moved from Trump is my last choice but better than Hillary to 2020, Trump is my first choice and my boat is the third boat in the boat parade to now 2024, that it's not just Trump, it's also Trumpism is our first choice. So what you're beginning to see now is, and this really started to get momentum 2019, 2020, but you really saw it in 2022, was the Republican primary voter beginning to elect a lot of Trump mini-me's and to select a lot of Trump mini-me's. We just saw, for example, Jake Tapper had the story of the North Carolina GOP primary nominee for the head of the school system in North Carolina, who had tweeted that we should execute Barack Obama and Joe Biden. This kind of attitude, just grossly transgressing sort of any form of basic moral norm, has now become almost mandatory in parts of the deepest red America. And guess what? Deepest red America is also the most evangelical.
And is that a change in the evangelical community and philosophy or in the politics? I mean, what's going on there?
Well, I will put it like this, Harry. I'd say that it is a change from what the evangelical community said about itself. Because what it said about itself prior to the rise of Trump is, and there were statements on the importance of moral character in public officials that were put out during the Clinton era. The evangelical community told pollsters that they were the most concerned of all American demographics about the character of the leaders that they voted for. But by the time Trump came around and Trump was dominant, evangelicals switched to being the least concerned of every major voting group about character. And so what I would say is you don't actually make that kind of dramatic change without there being a lot of seeds planted before. And so I think that what has happened is that what we have seen in evangelical community that over decades has been whipped into such a political frenzy that it really views politics through an ends justifies the means prism now. And that is not, growing up evangelical and conservative, I was never taught ends justifies the means. I was taught the opposite of that. But when it came to the choice between losing a presidential election and upholding the values you've told America for decades that you uphold, they chose they'd rather win than uphold the values they told America they believed in.
Harry, this goes back to the 80s when the Republican Party started to court very right-wing religions, and they started to do it through the abortion issue and some others. But I want to just say what's fascinating. Joe Biden is probably the most religious president that we've had in a very long time. Trump, forget about it. He doesn't even come close. So you've got this irony, right, of a president who is, and I know this so well, I think the reason he's been able to survive all the loss and everything he went through is his deep religious faith. So I think, listening to David talk about this, I would love to see the campaign put together religious leaders of all denominations. I know it's sort of in one way it goes against, quote unquote, the Democrats to use religion. But I always did. I remember when they said you have to have prayer in the school and we need a constitutional amendment. And I stood up and said, you know what? I don't need a constitutional amendment to pray in school. I pray every day. I pray the teacher doesn't call on me because I'm not prepared. So, we can handle this. I would love to see a broad array of religious leaders of every denomination, standing behind Joe. We have to win. And maybe we reach some of those people because it is scary to think that very religious people would go for this guy who certainly doesn't carry out love, caring, compassion, and everything that we identify with religion.
It's now time to take a moment for our sidebar feature, which explains some of the issues and topics that are prominent in the news. Today's sidebar is about the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, the federal agency responsible for coordinating responses to disasters that overwhelm local or state efforts. To explain this issue, we welcome Minnie Driver. Minnie Driver is an Oscar and Golden Globe nominated actress, best known for her roles in Good Will Hunting, Phantom of the Opera, and The Riches, among many others. In addition to her acting career, she is also a singer-songwriter who has released 3 critically acclaimed solo albums and is the author of the book, Managing Expectations. I give you Minnie Driver on the Federal Emergency Management Agency.
The Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, was created in 1978. Now a subsidiary of the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, FEMA's purpose is to coordinate response to disasters that overwhelm local or state efforts. The agency is involved in active recovery efforts, such as search and rescue. It also undertakes pre-disaster preparedness and provides local and state authorities with funding and experts to help in rebuilding and stabilizing a community after a disaster. Prior to the enactment of FEMA, government emergency relief was composed of disconnected and discrete efforts aimed at individual issues. This included FDR's Federal Emergency Relief Administration, largely a Depression-era employment program. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers became responsible for flood control and irrigation projects in 1944. In 1973, these measures were brought together under the Department of Housing and Urban Development in the Federal Disaster Assistance Administration. The capacity of this group and related federal offices continued to expand in a staggered fashion as Congress responded to relief issues as they arose, rather than according to any unified or comprehensive plan. This all changed in 1978 with President Jimmy Carter's unification of civil defense and disaster preparedness under FEMA. It was a controversial move to house different functions under one administrative umbrella, but FEMA continued to operate as a wide-ranging disaster preparedness agency, and in fact Congress continued to expand the agency's powers. FEMA came to be responsible for dam security, earthquake hazards, emergency food and shelter, and hazardous materials responses, among other issues. In general, FEMA engages in active disaster responses anytime a governor declares a state of emergency and requests the federal government for assistance. FEMA has not been an unadulterated success story. A major failure for the FEMA system was seen in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina in 2005. FEMA operations were overwhelmed by the size and scope of necessary rescue operations at the time. This included a failure to maintain a suitable number of trained personnel for hurricane response, as well as a general failure in logistics and planning to provide shelter and resources to those in need. These criticisms have led to proposals for changes to the structure of FEMA, as it had only recently been incorporated into the Department of Homeland Security in 2003. The Post-Katrina Emergency Reform Act of 2006 significantly restructured FEMA to help address these issues. FEMA has continued to receive criticisms for its cumbersome responses to Hurricane Maria and Hurricane Harvey. For Talking Feds, I'm Minnie Driver.
Thank you very much, Minnie Driver. Season 3 of Minnie's podcast, Minnie Questions with Minnie Driver, just launched this month. You can find it on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. All right, it is now time for a spirited debate brought to you by our sponsor, Total Wine and More. Each episode, you'll be hearing an expert talk about the pros and cons of a particular issue in the world of wine, spirit, and beverages.
Thank you, Harry. In today's spirited debate, Bordeaux and Napa face off, pitting the Bordeaux Reds against the California Cabs. From a numbers standpoint, the Bordeaux region is the clear winner, with more wineries and higher production of bottles, producing nearly 6.5 times more wine than Napa. But more doesn't necessarily mean better. Bordeaux wines are a blend of 5 different grapes. The Bordeaux region is actually divided by an estuary and 2 rivers forming the left bank and the right bank. Left bank wines are predominantly Cabernet Sauvignon based, featuring more tannins and bigger overall structure. Right bank wines are predominantly Merlot based, richer in fruit, with a softer mouthfeel and less tannin and acidity. Now, much like the left bank, Napa wines are predominantly Cabernet Sauvignon, and well known for their rich, bold style. Many of these wines are also blends, but you can also find 100% varietal wines from Napa. So whether you're Team Bordeaux or Team Napa, Your local Total Wine & More has a huge selection, so you can enjoy the best of both worlds at a price that won't break the left or right bank. So find what you love and love what you find, only at Total Wine & More. Cheers!
Thanks to our friends at Total Wine & More for today's A Spirited Debate. Let's give 1 minute to a cohort you've identified a couple times in this conversation, Senator, which is the people who are really disgruntled with his prosecution of the war and his perceived support for Israel. It's, again, a whole hour conversation. I just want to serve it up in political terms. We've had perennially in elections a kind of grumbling from the left, especially young voters on the left, that really kind of evaporates by the time of the election. You know, if you don't choose Sanders, we may not be with you. And then more often than not, they just don't vote anyway, as if they were going to. How serious a threat do you see the potential? You know, we had in primaries anywhere from 10 to 20% of voters going uncommitted in this sort of small movement way. Is this something that really carries over to November and a bridge he has to build lest he lose votes that otherwise would have gone to him?
Well, I'll jump in as a Jewish American and say this. I think in an election like this, where it's going to be very close and all of these other, crazy things that could happen, like Kennedy getting a certain amount of votes and all this, every vote counts. So to me, you're not going to be able to appease every part of the Democratic coalition, but you need to gain respect from them. This is how I've always felt. When I ran one time out of my 4 times for the Senate, I was very much against the Iraq War. The Iraq War was very popular in the beginning in my state, like 80%. And I voted against it. I spoke against it. And everyone said, you're going to lose, you're going to lose. I didn't lose because even people who didn't agree with me respected me. Now, I think we know what Joe Biden wants. What he wants is what most Americans want. They want an end to this thing. They want the hostages back. They want Hamas gone. They want a 2-state solution. That's a mainstream thing. And I think the more he shows that he is for that. Now, with Chuck Schumer stepping up and telling the truth, which is that Netanyahu, who appears to be certainly the wrong leader because he seems to be putting himself above the future of Israel, that was courageous. And so summing it up, I think what the president has to do is tell the people what his vision is, stand up for that vision. And it really is to bring everybody together. This is the Israelis and the Palestinians. The one who started all this was Hamas. We've got to get past this. It's very rough. And I think some of the people on the left have forgotten who started the whole thing, and that's wrong. So it's very tough. Harry, I don't have an answer. In a situation like this, Joe Biden has to put his vision out there, tell the truth. Last point, if the people who oppose Joe on this think they're going to do better with Trump, I could sell them a rock and tell them it's a diamond, because Trump is going to be, so bad on this issue.
I think the Schumer speech is huge. I think it's a great point. I think it's a Rubicon to have crossed. When you are the leader of Israel and Chuck Schumer publicly separates from you, I mean, that is a Rubicon to cross in our culture, because when Chuck Schumer gets to the point where he says, I am politically on safe ground to say Netanyahu should go, that marks a change in the way things are perceived. Look, I think that we have gotten to a point where so many of us, Jews like myself, who wanted badly to support Israel in the beginning, it has become impossible to support Netanyahu now. What I think is that we are getting to a point where the public at large, not necessarily those who are the most involved in activism on the left, but the public at large, are beginning to view this as Biden has been handed a soup sandwich. And I think that he is going to get credit ultimately for trying his best to navigate a soup sandwich. And that's an Army term, as David would know.
Yeah, I know.
And so when I think about who the folks are who would potentially stay home, and it is a real concern, I think about it not in terms of large amounts of voters, but it's more in terms of people who would otherwise be activists, very involved in the campaign, because it is a group that largely crosses over with the folks who are the most terminally online, the super users of social media, for instance, or the super consumers of cable news, which is a number in America that is like less than 5% of people. And so what that means is that just like in the last campaign, if Joe Biden can continue, and I think he will, to focus on how this stuff plays out with regular people and not with the most active news consumers and activists, you're probably going to be okay, because fortunately, the overwhelming majority of voters do view elections more as public transportation than a rental car, meaning they don't think about how do I get exactly to the place I'm going, pull up into a parking spot and walk right in. They think, what bus do I have to take to get close enough to have a shorter walk? Which is to say, most people are not going to demand that their candidate agree with everything, to Barbara's point earlier. And so I think we'll be okay, but I do think it will hurt us on the organizing side.
David, I want you to have the last word, but I just want to say, Jason, you are the repository of an encyclopedic list of beautiful metaphors. And if nothing else, I love it when you are on for that reason.
Oh, thanks.
David, last word to you.
First, can I just say is I'm having just a massive amount of cognitive dissonance as a longtime Reagan conservative defending
Right.
Joe Biden as much as I've been defending Joe Biden.
It's going around, you know?
Yeah. I just think he's been correct on the merits. So if you look at Israel and Gaza, much less like Ukraine or China or whatever, if you look at Israel and Gaza, his position from the beginning has been the correct position, in my view, which is Israel has a right to defend itself against Hamas, and Israel has an obligation to uphold the laws of war. Both of those things exist simultaneously, and he has protected and he has defended Israel's right to defend itself, and he has urged Israel to uphold the laws of armed conflict. That's exactly the right place to be. Trump, as Senator Boxer was saying very eloquently when you're talking about mainstream versus extreme, Trump's position would be essentially Israel can do whatever it wants, whenever it wants. If Israel was going to absolutely carpet bomb Gaza, I don't think that Trump would stop them. And so the Trump answer would be not only inhumane, it would be deeply destabilizing. And in both the major armed conflicts in the world right now, Israel, Gaza, Ukraine, and Russia, Biden has responded in a way that defends Western values, upholds human rights, and has retained, if not actually solidified, the Western alliance. And so to the extent any of this matters really, truly to people, Joe Biden has a good story to tell. Donald Trump has an extreme story to tell on both ends, at Israel and Ukraine. And I love the senator's formulation of this, because it is Trump who is the absolute dangerous extremist on these points. And it's Joe Biden who is continuing the grand tradition of American defense of liberal democracy.
Very well said. And as I recall, Trump, the first thing he said after October 7th was, if I had been president, it never would have happened. One of the many fantasy lines to buy into. Okay, I really wanted to touch quickly on the different cases, the big ruling from McAfee, but it's just been too rich a discussion, and I wanted to go on. I'll just say, as the lawyer, I'll just counter Jason's use of the Army glossary with sports, because I used to be a baseball reporter, Lefty Gomez, and it's better to be lucky than good, because Trump, again, has had a week that by and large has helped his overall cause of delay, including the mess in Fulton County. It may or may not now be settled, but in that political goal of just keeping a reckoning from happening, he's not out of the woods, but man, he's had some lucky breaks.
You could have also gone with looks like a line drive in the scorebook. You can have a lazy pop-up that happens to drop in, but in the stat sheet, it looks like a line drive. And that's what's happening with Trump's legal defense.
Again, the king of metaphors. Okay, we're out of time. We have just a minute left for our final feature of 5 words or fewer. This one this week comes from the Academy Award world, where Oppenheimer had a very good week, including getting Best Picture. So the question is, what is our nuclear policy? You know, what the Manhattan Project of 2024 look like under Donald Trump? 5 words or fewer, please. Anyone?
I'll go. Like nothing we've ever seen.
I can only get it to 6 words. So sorry for the norm violation, but I imagine him being briefed on something called the Manhattan Project, and he goes, nukes? I thought this was real estate.
That's great.
I think his moment, he would say, martial law, and infrastructure.
There you go.
That's the winner right there. That's good.
And that gives you the extra word. We're at 15 words, and I'll take my 5 for 20. Buy nuclear weapons from Iran. We are out of time. Thank you so much to Senator Boxer, Jason, and David. And thank you very much, listeners, for tuning in to Talking Feds. If you like what you've heard, please tell a friend to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts or wherever they get their podcasts. And please take a moment to rate and review this podcast. You can also subscribe to us on YouTube, where we post full episodes, talking books, and bonus video content. You can follow us on Twitter at TalkingFedsPod, and you can look to see our latest offerings on Patreon. Talking Feds is a completely independent production, so if you like the work we do and are inclined to support the show, joining our Patreon is the best way to do it. And you can now leave voicemails with your questions for me and our guests, whether it's for Talking 5 or general questions about the inner workings of the legal system for our sidebar segments. All you have to do is call 727-279-5339 and leave a voice message. That's 727-279-5339. And you can still also, of course, email us your questions at questions@talkingfeds.com. Thanks for tuning in, and don't worry, as long as you need answers, the feds will keep talking. Talking Feds is produced by Catherine Devine. Associate producer Meredith McCabe, sound engineering by Matt McArdle. Our research producer is Zeke Reed. Rosie Don Griffin and David Lieberman are our contributing writers. Production assistance by Akshaj Turbailu, and our music by the amazing Philip Glass. Thanks very much to Minnie Driver for explaining the Federal Emergency Management Agency. A special thanks to Richard Guérin for all his help with our many franchises. Talking Feds is a production of Delito LLC. I'm Harry Littman. Talk to you later.